Thank you, Claire, and welcome to everyone. It is such a pleasure to be the one who gets to introduce Maria to all of you today. I suspect a lot of you already know her quite well. She's been at the New York Foundation since 1994 and has been the executive director there since 2003. How many people here are grantees at the New York Foundation? So you guys know the foundation really well, but for the rest of you, you should know it's actually one of the oldest foundations in the country. It was started in 1909. And what's interesting about that is that its focus is community organizing and advocacy. So when you think about the fact 1909, that's pretty interesting. From that perch, Maria has actually become, over this last decade, I would say one of the most innovative and hands-on philanthropic leaders we have in our city. You have her bio in your packet, and I'm not going to take up our time by reading it. But what I want to say is when you look at that, you'll see that she comes from the nonprofit community. And she's done a lot of, her focus has been on community organizing and advocacy. And she is one of those foundation leaders that has brought that nonprofit perspective into her work as a foundation leader. And it really infuses how she runs the foundation and what she does. I'm going to give you two examples of what I see as her very hands-on, creative leadership style. And I have no idea how she's going to answer that question about what's in the box and what's out of the box, but I look forward to that as well as I was thinking about this. So two examples of some creative leadership. At Philanthropy New York, members do programs for other members where they decide there's a critical issue that really matters to the community and they want to teach their peers about that issue. We do lots and lots of programs, and 99% of them really follow the same format. So this last September, when Maria decided that it was critically important for the foundation community in New York to really understand in a very deep way what's going on with the Muslim community in New York, she threw away the normal format that people use. And she created, with a few peers, a day-long tour of the Muslim community around the city, which involved putting people on a bus and actually going and having a dialogue the entire day with community leaders in their community. It was really a very different and ambitious program, and it was hugely successful. And that was her really thinking differently about how to do some serious learning and community building with her peers. A second example I want to use is mentioned in her bio, and I don't know if she's going to talk about it, but if she doesn't, I encourage you all to ask her about it during the question period. It was her decision to be an executive on loan to Gladys Carrion, who is the commissioner of the New York State Office of Children and Families. And this meant that as a foundation leader with an enormous amount of responsibility, she decided to put herself in the potentially uncomfortable and very complex situation of being inside a government agency so that she could really learn how that agency works and bring that learning back to her foundation. To me, this really epitomizes taking that combination of being creative, being willing to be very hands-on, and taking a bit of a risk, and doing that as a leader has the capacity to do. So I was enormously impressed with that and hope that other people follow her pattern. One more fact about Maria. So it turns out, and this is probably not a huge surprise, that she takes that same hands-on creative approach into her personal life. So I do love Google. I'm not quite at Twitter yet, but you know, Google is fabulous. So in Googling Maria, one of the things that came up is a comment she made in the PS 102 newsletter a few years back. Oh yeah, where she talked about the fact that working parents must be very creative to find a way to actually be leaders within their school. So what did she do? She created a calendar of events for the community, which she did at home on the weekend every month for 10 years. So that really impressed me to add that to her job. So I want to now ask you to help me welcome a proud past volunteer of PS 102 and the current New York Foundation Executive Director, Maria Matola.
It's very scary to imagine what's on Google about us. Wow. So I want to start by asking everybody to kind of think a little bit about who you were at 10 years old for a minute, and start with the question. So how many of you imagined yourself coming to New York City, a young person, and dreamed of being a leader at a local nonprofit? Anybody? Oh, one person, very good. Really, who moves to New York City with that dream? When was the last time you found yourself riding around in a taxi cab and the cab driver says to you, "Oh, I came to New York dreaming of being the leader of a local nonprofit, but instead I'm driving this cab"? That really never happens, right? I have to admit right off the bat, I'm also a cliche. Like most people, I came to New York dreaming to be an artist or a writer or an actress. I would have taken any of those things. But ultimately, I decided that a day job was actually a good thing to have. I went to school to study social work, and learning to be a professional involved studying and learning a particular set of rules to follow. But what the books couldn't teach me, I learned from the people I worked with in the field, who showed me that working in the social sector was not only a science, but an art. The people I've met in the nonprofit sector are some of the most creative people I know. When I heard the title of today's symposium, I actually thought of one of my favorite New Yorker cartoons, and I hope you can all see it. Thinking outside the box made me think about this cartoon, and the tagline is, "Actually, I got some pretty good ideas inside the box." What I want to say is this: you do some of your best thinking inside the box. Don't dismiss the box, occupy the box. There's a reason they call this the independent sector. We don't fit neatly into any box. We're not fully defined by either. Our box is not some big box version of a store churning out happy, more reliable workforce. Whoops. And it's not an extension of the government, churning out happy citizens mindful of all the good their taxes are doing. There we go. It's time that we define the nonprofit sector on our own terms. Attempts to corporatize or politicize the nonprofit sector feel wrong to us because they underplay the creative and human aspect of our intention. This is what distinguishes your work. You do this work because you want to, not because you have to. You value connectivity over competition, and you don't provide units of service. Each interaction is an opportunity to tap into the possibility that individuals and communities have. The New York Foundation, where I work, as Rana said, has a long history of supporting startup nonprofits that value self-determination and systems change. Most of our grantees use community organizing and advocacy in their work. It's not the only approach, but it's the approach that our trustees settled on. They really had the sense to see that the modest size of our foundation gave us certain advantages. We could act based on our faith in untested ideas, even before anyone was sure that they could work. Many of the nonprofit leaders I have met in my work for the foundation have defined the box on their own terms in very creative ways. So I want to give you some examples. First, picture a storefront box. It is on a very busy avenue in Brooklyn, full of signs that reflect the new immigrant community that's recently moved there. Residents who are themselves immigrants opened its doors soon after 9/11, volunteering to assist people who felt singled out and discriminated against. An established local hospital assigned a social worker to be on site who recruited and supervised AmeriCorps volunteers. They ran after-school programs, taught ESL classes, and mobilized residents to become more civically engaged. Today, that organization still runs on a tiny budget, but it serves hundreds of families, and it's nationally recognized for its civic engagement work. Now imagine another storefront box. This time, the inside looks like a neighborhood cafe. This nonprofit's not new, it's 25 years old, and it's a soup kitchen. But a grant from a large foundation allowed them to reimagine their space and convert it from a traditional soup kitchen to a more welcoming place with tables, lots of light, and a large window that opens out onto the street. But the staff and board of this group went further and restructured the entire organization. People who use the soup kitchen, volunteers, and clients and staff are now considered members. Members are oriented to the organization's mission and history and have a role in decision-making. Though the transition's not been easy, the culture shift had a major impact on the staff, volunteers, how people interact with people who use the soup kitchen, and it's connected the group's members to citywide organizing and advocacy campaigns around income inequity. Box number 3 is not a physical structure. This next nonprofit does its work on the street through outreach. They have no office. The group is a membership of 1,400 gay and lesbian youth of color. They have staff, they have board members, but they're all drawn from, they all range in age from 19 to 29. The group uses a shared leadership model. Its youth leaders and board members make all the decisions, and the youth are mentored by adult allies from more established organizations. This organization fought and won services for street youth in the village and has been recognized nationally for its grassroots fundraising efforts. The final box is a brand new renovated warehouse space located across the street from a large public housing project. This nonprofit was started by a young social worker who worked for a local hospital and had the idea to engage residents to help her conduct a health survey of the people who lived in the housing projects. The residents, called community change workers, became so engaged in getting information from their neighbors, they wanted to do more. 5 years later, this now nonprofit, now independent from the hospital, operates education, employment, health, and community development programs for neighborhood residents. The momentum for its work comes from the people living in the community, and so 53 of the group's 57 staff members live in the local public housing project. In 2009, they converted an empty warehouse into a community center, and $10,000 of the funds were raised from residents of the local housing project. Now, 3 things stand out for me about these stories, the things that they had in common. First, the leaders had a sense of purpose. They said to themselves, this needs doing. We can't ignore this anymore. Something needs to change. 2, they believed in their approach. They saw the solution to the problem in a different way, and they felt their perspective mattered. Finally, they had the feeling that they had to take matters into their own hands, not in a rugged Clint Eastwood kind of a way, but rather because they wanted to be self-directed. They were acting with autonomy. It is not easy for nonprofits to hold on to these qualities over time, I know, because of the constraints placed on them by foundations, government funders, and donors. To be good at what we do, we are told to use incentives, devise performance goals, and develop and adhere to proven models. These are not bad things, but research says something different about what motivates us to be good at what we do. Whoops. What did I do? No? Can't believe David Birdsell's in the audience. Okay. In his book called Drive, Daniel Pink explains that if people are motivated simply by outside rewards, the work becomes only what we are obligated to do. If people are focused strictly on goals and incentives, it reduces their creativity. Humans will problem solve by obsessing about what is expected of me instead of thinking about what is possible. But if nonprofits depend on outside support that is highly prescriptive, what can they do to exercise creative leadership? The good news is you already do. Jim Collins wrote a companion piece to his book, Good to Great, with the subtitle, Why Business Thinking is Not the Answer. He says nonprofit leaders have to deal with more complex power structures than their corporate counterparts. He distinguishes between two kinds of leadership. Executive leadership models concentrate power in one leader who ultimately has the job of making the right decisions. In legislative leadership, no one individual has enough structural power to make decisions alone. To make the right decisions happen, a leader has to be persuasive, observe politics, find allies, and look for shared interest. That's what nonprofit leaders are so good at. In fact, Collins suggests that corporate leaders could learn a lot from shadowing nonprofit executives rather than the other way around. Community Resource Exchange, our close partner in New York, did a study of more than 2,000 nonprofit leaders and for-profit leaders and found that nonprofit leaders outperform for-profit leaders in most indicators of good leadership practice. What strikes me about the leaders I met through my work at the foundation is that despite the small size of their organizations, they are big thinkers. Research shows that we are all born big thinkers. Think about the children you know, the way they dream, the way they are endlessly hopeful. We all remember a time when we felt less constrained and more able to be creative. We were allowed to try and fail and try something else. But we get taught over time to tone down our big thinking, to be realistic, to hone in, to follow instructions. And over time, it takes more work to be expansive, inspired, and confident. Are there ways for all of us, even larger nonprofits, to make room for creative thinking? Here are some ideas. Find ways to tap into the creativity of your staff. Some workplaces invite staff to dedicate a certain percentage of their time to a project of their own choosing. Called permitted bootlegging, it allows for individuals to take the initiative to improve or invent something. For example, the winners of the Nobel Prize for Physics in 2010 conceived of their winning idea during time the research lab allocated for projects not assigned. Second, develop partnerships with grassroots groups. Find mutually beneficial ways to work together, share resources. In the stories mentioned earlier, the key to these small groups' success was that they had strong mentors from established organizations. Finally, involve your constituents. The nonprofit box was conceived as a way of separating us, the professionals, from them, the community we serve. The late, great Bernie Wall of Goddard Riverside used to describe nonprofits as service stations, and worked really hard to make sure that wasn't true of Goddard Riverside. So create a culture of reciprocity throughout the organization and make space for clients, too, to exercise their self-determination and potential. I want to say a word about funders, because we need to be better at allowing creative big thinking to happen. Over time, this is how I've come to see the role of foundations. We are on the sidelines of the work you do. Like a scout, we do a lot of observing, listening, and try to learn to recognize the good work when we see it. Our own constraints, the expectations of our trustees, donors, pressure from the field, often set us looking for the highest performers by developing clear metrics for excellence and going to find those groups. That seems to make sense, but here's my question. If you use that approach, and you were the coach of the New York Knicks, would you have discovered this guy? Huh? That guy. He did not fit any of the standard metrics for star players. He did not have big-time college experience. He did not get drafted. He had not played significant minutes for either of his two prior teams. He was not particularly tall or fast. Would a data-based, outcome-driven approach to decision-making have helped you find Jeremy Lin? No. In fact, that approach would have left him sitting on the bench. And yet it was so exciting when seemingly out of nowhere this young player stepped up to replace his star teammates and everything changed. And it wasn't just about him and his individual playing. Without the star players to rely on, the whole team played differently, and now anything seems possible. Every once in a while those of us in the nonprofit sector are busy paying close attention to where we want to go and what we need to get there, something extraordinary happens that surprises us. It doesn't fit the rules. It draws from some innate energy that's just below the surface. It articulates something strongly felt but not yet expressed, and it reframes the whole conversation. The thing about good ideas is this: you can't always see them coming. Thank you.
And if you wouldn't mind, we have Jack Krauskopf who will be helping moderate the session of questions. And for those of you who have written down questions, our staff will be walking around. So don't be shy, right away.
Maybe I could start while the questions are getting brought up. One issue that I've always wondered with your foundation, because you start with new ideas and new organizations, and the little bit of familiarity I have with nonprofit organizations and people who want to start nonprofit organizations in New York, is that there are thousands of good ideas in this city that could be turned into good programs and new organizations. How do you pick and choose? You've given us hints of that in your very good talk, but how do you go about making that selection?
You know, the New York Foundation, I think, is actually kind of old-fashioned in this way. We actually have a mailbox and an address, and we accept proposals. So that's the first thing. And I think the other thing we do that is increasingly unusual is we actually have 2.5 staff people, including myself, and one other person and a part-time person. We read all the proposals, which I think is also getting a bit more unusual because they're on paper, which is this thing that looks like this. We don't accept...
Make boxes out of it.
We don't ask people to fill out a quiz first about whether they're eligible or not. We actually just read them the way we've always done. And I mean, I'm sort of joking, except that I think that one thing that nonprofits have to deal with increasingly are gates to get through, and gatekeepers, even just to ask the question, am I a candidate for a grant? Our work is not that hard. I mean, I know we have to say no to a lot of groups, and that's very difficult, but you know, I feel like it's still important to be an ear to people who have ideas about groups they want to start. We try to talk people out of starting groups sometimes. Sometimes we send them to Pat Swan. But we do it the way foundations did it for a long time. We have an open process. We discuss each group that comes in. We do site visits before we make our decisions, also kind of, I think, unusual these days. And we fund very few groups, but we still meet tons and tons of people who are doing amazing work in New York.
So here's a perfect follow-up question. How do you calculate risks when choosing new creative ideas?
So it's funny, one of the groups I mentioned in my 4 stories, the group that runs the soup kitchen, when they sent in their final report to us, it was all about how they appreciated that we let them make all these mistakes. They had tried a number of different approaches. They set out to do one very different thing, and after the 3 years of our grant support, they had completely changed the approach they wanted to take. And they were very appreciative of the fact that the foundation didn't cancel the grant, even though things didn't go along the way they expected them to. Our board is amazing. They are really, really risk takers. They are not. They do not ask us to put groups first through a certain kind of testing period or, engage in some kind of set up all their management systems and then we'll give them a grant. They really are interested in funding groups before any of that has happened. I was just saying to Hildy before things started, about half our groups have budgets under $250,000 a year. These are really small groups. I was telling Hildy, we sometimes have groups who get their first grant check and they haven't opened a bank account yet. So this is real risk-taking. And sometimes it doesn't work. Sometimes, like in the case of the soup kitchen, they try different things and eventually it does work. And sometimes the groups don't last, very long. But it doesn't mean that the work that they don't do in their communities isn't vital and important in some way.
So a number of people wanted elaboration on the ideas, the provocative ideas that you threw out. How do you balance letting good ideas bubble up, pursuing them without letting your organization get spread too thin supporting all of these efforts?
Yeah, and I think the only thing I have to say is it's easy for me to say to do those things, and I know it's much harder to implement them in real life. I think that in my reading to prepare for this talk,